Today I'd like to talk about Jordan Peterson. Not Jordan Peterson, the anti-PC, free speech supporting clinical psychologist, but Jordan Peterson, the Christian. On many subjects, I would consider myself to be a Jordan Peterson fanboy, but when it comes to religion, I can't help but view him as an entirely different person. I originally didn't want to comment on Peterson's Christianity, mainly because most of what he says comes across as wishy-washy, as very non-committal, as, well, kind of hollow, to be honest. But he has made some concrete claims. Most notoriously, he has claimed that atheists secretly believe in God. Let's watch.
Yes, you can be a non-believer, but the funny thing about that is, too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know. If there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. This is the argument that I tried to level at Sam Harris with regards to the metaphysical foundations of his ethics. It's like, it's the same sort of thing. And I think Ben Shapiro just went after him on the same grounds, is that I don't care what you say about whether or not you're an atheist, you act like you're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so you think you don't believe, but I think you do. But we have different definitions of what the word believe means.
Now where have I seen this before? Doesn't this remind you of a certain young Earth creationist? You know, the one who gave up on presenting evidence and decided that sophistry was way easier. Oh right, that's the one! If you've been subscribed to me for a while, get ready for a blast from the past.
He's the author and editor of ProofThatGodExists.org, a site that I have found absolutely fascinating, as it gives us or shows us why logic, science, and morality are consistent with the Christian worldview and not with any other worldview.
I don't heap evidence on people who say that they don't believe in God. What I do is I take their masks off. They say that there is no God, and I show them using logic, science, and morality that they actually do believe in God.
We've talked about how the Bible is our ultimate authority.
There really aren't any atheists or agnostics or unbelievers. They all are guilty when they stand before God. They all do know that God exists.
They will not have an excuse because they really are believers. They just suppress that truth.
So what I do in this website is I show that they actually do believe in absolute morality. I show that the basis of morality must be from the God of Scripture. But of course, they're going to try and explain it away another way.
Yeah, that's right. Young Earth creationists who had no evidence left to present opted for the argument that Jordan Peterson is now using. Not a good sign, but let's actually analyze this. So, Jordan Peterson believes that atheists are secretly Christians because, while they claim to not believe, actions speak louder than words. The fact that atheists don't rob banks and don't kill people indicates that they really do believe in morality, specifically Christian transcendent morality. To explain this a little more clearly, Peterson offers this analogy in another video of his, although I've modified it slightly to be a little more accurate. The original video is linked below. Young Earth creationists claim to not believe in what they call historical science, like the theory of evolution or cosmology, because no one directly observed it, therefore it's not really science. However, these same creationists would probably accept the conclusions of a forensics team in a murder trial, even though no one actually saw the murder take place. These young Earth creationists will have indicated, through their actions, that they really do believe in historical science, and that you can know things about the past even if you didn't directly observe it. In this same way, Peterson thinks that atheists really do believe in transcendent morality, that is, Christian values, even though they deny it. Peterson's idea is not new, and probably isn't his original thought. It's part of a field of debate that gained attention here on YouTube about 6 years ago, which is when I first saw these videos by Eric Hovind and Cy ten Bruggencate. This field of debate is called presuppositional apologetics, and it's basically an attempt to apply an idea called global skepticism to every worldview that isn't Christianity in order to demonstrate that Christianity is the only worldview in which humans can use reason and have morality, In simple terms, the strategy is, whenever your opponent provides an explanation for some part of their worldview, just keep asking them, why? And eventually, they'll have to say that that's just how the universe works if you go back enough steps, if you peel back enough layers. At which point you say, gotcha. For example, if someone asked you why the sky is blue, you'd say, well, because air molecules scatter higher energy blue light. Well, why do air particles scatter high energy blue light? Well, because higher energy light has a shorter wavelength, so it's more likely to collide with air molecules. So why does light bounce off these air molecules? And so on, until eventually the only answer we can give is, because that's just how the universe works. At which point, the presuppositional apologist says, aha, gotcha, you can't really explain anything. Of course, you could just as easily do this to Christians when they get back to God as their explanation. Why does God exist rather than not existing? Why does God have the properties he has instead of other properties? Etc. Anyway, that's just a brief recap of presuppositional apologetics, and how, ultimately, it's a double-edged sword. Every worldview is equally susceptible to it. If you go back enough steps, if you peel back enough layers, eventually, no matter what the worldview is, there will just be a foundational base set of assumptions or premises that just are, whether that's just how the universe works or whether that's just God's nature. Now let's address Jordan Peterson's claim. I have 5 main points to make against this idea, but first, might I just ask, Jordan, what is your moral foundation? I can't find any video in which you actually justify your own position, just videos where you deny your opponent's positions. What's so special about your transcendent moral values? What makes a moral value transcendent? How do you distinguish between transcendent morals and socially constructed ones? Why is it immoral to violate these transcendent values? Is it just immoral and that's it? That's just how the universe works in your worldview? Honestly, if anyone in the audience can show me where Peterson actually defends his own position, I'd be very interested to see it, because something tells me that the classic Euthyphro dilemma isn't quite getting at the kind of God that Jordan Peterson believes in. If I do find a video where Peterson defends his own moral foundation, I'll put a link to it in the video description. However, because I don't know how he would defend his own position, all I can do right now is respond to his arguments against the atheist position. So, point number 1, these moral intuitions existed long before Christianity. What about people who didn't steal before Christianity was invented? What worldview were those people borrowing from? Or did everyone steal, kill, and lie before Christianity because it was impossible to figure out that these things shouldn't be done?
Hey, good evening, Hezron, carver of graven images.
Ah, good evening, Homer the Thief. How is business?
Been a little slow these past few months. Not much to steal in the desert, you know. Hey, good evening, Zohar the adulterer. My wife sends her warmest regards.
Oh, yes. She's a good woman. Very good.
Thank you, my lusty friend.
Point number 2. What about other religions? Other religions also teach things like nonviolence, don't steal, tell the truth, etc. I mean, look at Jainism, for example. So who's to say that Jordan Peterson isn't enacting Jain or Buddhist metaphysics? Which religion gets to lay claim to these ideas? The fact that Peterson singles out Christianity as the owner of these ideas seems to illustrate his bias. And what if someone follows a moral principle that happens to line up with another religion and which is nowhere in Christianity? Vegetarians and vegans often cite moral concerns about animal products, so does that mean they secretly believe in Jainism? Now I can already hear the Christians citing Romans 1:18. Silly atheist, of course these moral intuitions existed long before Christianity. God wrote them on our hearts so that no one is without excuse for sinful behavior. And this gets into my point number 3. These moral intuitions are the products of evolution, not divine revelation. For starters, humans aren't the only animals with morality written on our hearts. Other intelligent animals live according to ideas like fairness. It's been demonstrated that many primates, and animals in other orders as well, understand this idea. Are monkeys Christians too? Are dolphins secretly religious? I don't think you want to go down this rabbit hole. Another interesting observation is the fact that the golden rule is actually a very effective strategy for getting the best result in a classic prisoner's dilemma, wherein cooperation at a task benefits both parties, defecting by yourself wins big at the expense of the other party, but both parties defecting gains little to nothing for anyone. In Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, yes, this book again, go read it, he describes a contest in which programmers and game theorists were asked to submit their own computer programs to play against each other in a prisoner's dilemma. While many contestants submitted complex, ingenious, and downright devious programs, the winning program was by far the simplest. It was called Tit for Tat, and all it did was follow the golden rule, after initially cooperating for one turn. All it did was reciprocate its opponent's last move. This is strong evidence that the golden rule evolved because it was beneficial to the individuals who followed it, as it is to many other social animals as well. With all that said, I think it's fair to say that atheists are not borrowing from Christianity. Christianity is borrowing from biology, and trying to take exclusive ownership of basic human traits. This leads us to point number 4, and this is going to sound like a bit of a concession, although this has been my position for years. These moral opinions of ours are not absolute or transcendent. They are simply evolved, even though we tend to feel like they are absolute and transcendent, and even though many people will claim as much on a survey. And that does raise the question, well, why would we view our moral intuitions this way if they weren't absolute and transcendent? Why do we feel like they are if they aren't? Well, basically, if we didn't feel this way, then we'd be a lot less likely to follow these intuitions, which, as we've seen from the prisoner's dilemma, would be detrimental to us. It's a similar thing with regard to the sensation of pain. You could rightly ask, why does it have to be so damn painful? Why do such extreme levels of pain need to exist? Why couldn't our bodies just raise a little red flag instead of creating debilitating, unbearable, maddening levels of pain? Well, one explanation is because otherwise we might not give it the critical attention it deserves, in favor of other, conflicting interests. When you get right down to it, morality is a heuristic. It's a useful rule of thumb that is quick and dirty, but useful. So what if we view these intuitions as transcendent obligations? Any introductory psychology class will tell you about a whole host of bad human heuristics that we assume to be true, but which are not, though they can be useful. I would expect a psychologist like Jordan Peterson to have anticipated this objection. And finally, we reach point number 5, and this is my key point. Even if there are absolute, transcendent morals within the universe, the world would look exactly the same without them. It would be impossible to distinguish a world with transcendent moral values from a world with only subjective values. This is because people will always behave in ways which maximize the things that they, subjectively, value. And no matter what the rules of the game are, no matter the specific limitations, people will always do this. I'd like to play a clip from an old video by the user Theoretical Bullshit, who laid out these ideas perfectly.
Now, one very fundamental motivation for wanting to treat others the way we want to be treated is simple observation. As a human being, when I meet someone who is rude or arrogant or mean, intrusive, hypocritical, dishonest, or violent, I observe that I don't like that person. I don't want to be around them. I don't want to do favors for them. I don't wish good fortune upon them. I don't want to help them or interact with them in any way. Likewise, when I meet someone who is kind, considerate, respectful, fair, and compassionate, I observe that I do like them. I gravitate toward them. I want them in my life. I want to help them. I want them to be happy. I want them to like me. I want to continue having a mutually beneficial relationship with them. I can also observe that I want to like myself. I'm stuck with myself 24 hours a day, and I want to enjoy who I am because I will be happier than if I didn't like myself. And it follows that a very good way to make this happen is to be the kind of person I like and abstain from being the kind of person I dislike. It's not rocket science. Now, this isn't a conscious thought process for everyone, and clearly not everyone would articulate it in this way, but I do think that many of us are compelled to want to behave morally for reasons somewhat similar to this, whether a God exists or not, whether we know it or not. But why ought I behave this way? Well, that's easy. Because in order to live in a healthy, happy, cooperative, flourishing society, in order to maintain relationships from which we will benefit, in order to be treated fairly, respectfully, and compassionately by others, in order to like ourselves as a result of being the kind of person we enjoy, we ought to behave in a certain way because doing so is the best known method for actualizing these circumstances. This is a fact. If you don't desire these circumstances, if you inexplicably prefer an unhealthy, unhappy, uncooperative, failing community, if you prefer to alienate yourself from relationships that would be beneficial to you, if you prefer to be treated with hostility, disrespect, and contempt, if you prefer to be the kind of person you dislike, then by all means behave immorally. But you should probably know something. I and the overwhelming majority of our community do desire a healthy, happy, cooperative, flourishing society, and we will try to coerce you to behave in a way conducive to that. And if we can't, we will stop you. Why? Because that's what we ought to do in order to live in a healthy, happy, cooperative, flourishing society. Tough shit. Now, you may object that what I'm talking about is not a moral ought, it's simply a rational ought. It's rational to behave in certain ways in order to actualize a desired circumstance, but a moral ought is something that we just ought to do unconditionally, period. And you may claim that while an atheistic worldview allows us to derive a rational ought from what simply is the case, it does not allow us to derive a moral ought from what is the case. Well, then I think you should know something. These unconditional moral oughts, as you define them, are a figment of your imagination. Even if a God does exist. You can't get an unconditional moral ought from Christianity any more than you can from atheism. For example, the Christian worldview says that there is a creator who brought us into existence and provided us with rules to follow regarding our conduct toward himself and each other, and that these rules are derivative of his character and nature, which happens to be one of love, honesty, justice, etc. But everything I just mentioned, and anything I could possibly mention about Christianity, describes what is the case, not what ought be the case. And there's nothing about God's nature or qualities or existence that changes that. To say that God is all-powerful, or that he has infinite knowledge, or that he's non-physical, or that he exists outside of time and space, or that he's loving or compassionate, still does nothing to explain why the statement, God says to do X, means we ought to do X. Sure, you ought to do what God commands if you want to be saved, if you want to spend eternity with him in heaven, if you want to emulate God's character, and so on, but those would be what you're calling rational oughts, now wouldn't they? To say that God commands us not to engage in homosexual behavior, for example, is a descriptive statement and nothing more. It describes what is the case. It is the case that God commands us not to engage in homosexual behavior. But Christians can't derive a moral ought from that any more than I can derive a moral ought from the statement, California law prohibits texting while driving. Moral oughts, as my detractors define them, simply do not exist in any worldview. They are a complete fiction. There are only rational oughts, whether you recognize this or not. And in any case, I wonder what good Christians think it does to believe in these unconditional moral oughts anyway. If I, for some reason, preferred an unhealthy, unhappy, uncooperative, failing community, if I preferred to alienate myself from relationships that would be beneficial to me, would believing that my behavior violates some unconditional, absolute, intangible moral ought dissuade me from behaving that way? No, not at all. I'm still going to behave whichever way is conducive to my desired circumstance. Now, let's say you told me that the creator of the universe wants me to change my behavior. Well, whether I change my behavior or not is going to be contingent upon whether I care about doing what the creator of the universe wants me to do. Maybe I care, maybe I don't, but however I proceed will be according to which circumstance I desire. What if you told me that I would spend eternity in hell if I continued to behave in this way? Well, whether this works on me or not, it proves that my actions are still contingent upon desired circumstances, not some intangible absolute moral ought. If I wish to avoid hell, I have a reason to change my behavior, but if I prefer hell, I have zero reasons for changing my behavior, and you can bet that I won't. Let's try a thought experiment, okay? Let's imagine that God comes to you and tells you that there are unconditional, transcendent, absolute moral oughts in the universe, things that you just ought do and things that you just ought not do. And it just so happens that all the things that you ought to do will create unfathomable pain, suffering, and injustice, and ultimately land you in hell, where you'll burn and choke and scream and cough for all of eternity. However, all the things that you ought not do happen to promote peace and health and happiness and justice, and will land you in heaven, where you will experience eternal bliss alongside your Creator for all time. Knowing this, how would you live your life? Would you adhere to these intangible, transcendent, unconditional moral oughts? or not. I hear it argued all the time that if God doesn't exist, nobody has grounds for telling anybody else what they ought or ought not do. But that's so naive. It's so fucking naive. Whether we recognize it or not, our choices and our behavior are simply not informed by these unconditional, transcendent, absolute moral oughts. They're informed by rational oughts, by what circumstances we seek to actualize. And this is true irrespective of God's existence or our belief in him. The fact is, a world in which these unconditional moral oughts exist would be indistinguishable from a world in which only rational oughts exist. So aside from its inherent triviality, there's certainly no practical advantage to thinking this way either. It does absolutely nothing to give our moral claims a more solid foundation. All it does is serve to make Christians feel warm and fuzzy inside.
So now that we've laid out the argument, let's analyze another video where Jordan Peterson goes into a little more detail.
Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want.
And if there is a God, you can still do whatever you want. Indeed, according to Christianity, some of God's angels sided with Lucifer. They did exactly what they wanted to do. The existence of God, or rather the existence of transcendent morality, does not prevent you from doing whatever you want, and from doing what you think is rational for you to do.
So if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value.
Well, most humans do have similar foundational evolved values, as do many other animals, which means that, for the most part, we can use reason to work out how we, as individuals, as a group, should behave. And because these values are products of our biology, it's fairly certain that these values will not change. Jordan Peterson himself has said, and I've agreed, that it's unlikely that women will ever be 50% of CEOs or politicians because of men and women's different evolved predispositions. If that's so obvious to you, Jordan, why is the robustness of general human moral values so uncertain? Are biology's habits hard to break, or are they just passing trivialities?
This is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it?
In and of itself, it's not irrational. What is irrational is the rest of us standing by and letting you get away with it, as theoretical bullshit explained. If we value cooperation, then we ought to stop you. That doesn't have the nice fuzzy sensation of transcendent godly morality, but that's just how the world works, whether or not transcendent morality exists. Deal with it.
To me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic.
Well, as we've seen, atheists are not borrowing from Christianity. Christianity is borrowing from human nature. And Christianity doesn't even provide a solid foundation either, since global skepticism can be applied to God just as easily as it can be applied to anything else. Why is it moral to follow God? Well, that's just how I think the universe works.
To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition, Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality.
Prove it. Prove that Western cultures could not simply have been founded by a bunch of people who decided that if they subjectively value certain things, like equality under the law, then they ought to construct a government which promotes those outcomes and which punishes things that don't. How is that impossible? It's not. That's exactly what happened. If you accept that humans have a common evolved moral intuition, as it seems many other animals do, then you have no argument. Like I said at the beginning of this video, Jordan Peterson seems to be an entirely different person when he starts talking about religion and morality, and honestly, I'm pretty disappointed.